Clara Bennett pressed both hands flat against the wooden counter of Dawson's general store and did not move a single muscle while Gerald Holt told a room full of people that she was not the kind of woman any man would be proud to stand beside. 7 men had said some version of that same thing. 7 times she had walked out of somewhere with her chin up, and her chest caved in, and her hands shaking where nobody could see them. She was done, not done fighting, done apologizing for being exactly who she was. What none of those 7 men knew, what nobody in Red Hollow knew, was that 3 weeks later, the most feared man in the entire territory was going to look at Clara Bennett across a dusty yard and see something not one of them had ever bothered to look for. And what he saw was going to bring down the most powerful criminal in northern Montana. If you've ever been told you were too much or not enough, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels, because the woman 7 men rejected. She was never unwanted. She was just waiting for a man worth choosing her back. She was 27 years old. In Red Hollow, Montana, in the year 1883, 27 was not young for a woman who had not yet married. People did not say this to Clara's face with any particular cruelty. They said it the way people said most cruel things in small towns, with concern in their voices and pity in their eyes, and a certain satisfaction underneath both that they would never admit to out loud. Her mother had died when Clara was 16, leaving her with a small house at the edge of town, a garden that needed constant attention, and a father whose grief had turned him into a man who sat in a chair by the window and watched the road as though he was to aim for someone who was never coming back. Clara had managed everything: the house, the garden. The accounts her father could no longer focus on. She had taught herself to keep records by studying the ledger books at the town hall when Mr. Dawson allowed her to sit in the back office on slow afternoons. She had learned to repair leather by watching the harness maker work. She had learned to stretch a meal across 3 days and make it taste like something you were glad to eat. When her father died 4 years later, Clara had been 20 years old and entirely alone, and she had handled his affairs with a steadiness that surprised people who expected her to collapse. She did not collapse. She went home. She sat down at the kitchen table. She added up what she had and what she owed, and she made a plan. That was Clara Bennett, but Red Hollow did not see plans. Red Hollow saw a woman with a fuller figure and no husband and no family money, and made a series of very simple calculations that had nothing to do with ledger books. The first man who had considered marrying her was Thomas Acker, a farmer's son who had seemed genuinely interested for nearly 3 months before he told her, apologetically, that his mother felt a woman of Clara's build might struggle with the physical demands of farm life. He married a thin girl from Billings 6 weeks later. Clara had wished him well and meant it, mostly. The second was a traveling merchant named Davis, who stayed in Red Hollow for a season and made Clara laugh more than anyone had in years. When he left, he sent her a letter explaining that a merchant's wife needed to make certain impressions on customers, and he hoped she understood. She understood. The third, fourth, and fifth were variations on the same story, told with different faces and different words that all meant the same thing. She was kind enough. She was capable enough. She was simply not the kind of woman a man in this territory was proud to present to other men. The sixth was a widower named Patterson, who had 2 young children, and who Clara had genuinely hoped might see her differently, because he himself had been judged harshly after his wife's death. He did not see her differently. He married the schoolteacher. And then Gerald Holt had been the 7th, and Gerald Holt had done it in the middle of Dawson's general store, on a Tuesday morning in July, with an audience and without a single trace of shame. Clara stood behind the livery stable and breathed and did not cry. She had done enough crying over the years in private. She had decided somewhere around the 4th rejection that crying about it did not change anything, and the tears cost her energy she could not afford to spend. What she did, instead of crying, was think. She thought about the $7.40 she had left after this month's supplies. She thought about the roof on her house, which had developed a soft spot near the eastern corner that was going to become a serious problem before winter. She thought about the order of dried goods she was waiting on from a merchant in Helena, and whether it would arrive before the passes got difficult. She was thinking about the Helena order when she heard boots on the packed earth around the corner of the livery. Not the shuffling, uncertain steps of someone who wasn't sure they belonged somewhere. These were deliberate, even, the steps of someone who moved through the world with the settled certainty that the world would move around them if needed. Clara straightened up and turned around. The man who had come around the corner of the livery stable was tall enough that he had to angle slightly through the narrow passage between the building and the fence. He was broad through the shoulders, in the way that came from actual work in actual mountains, not from posturing. His beard was full and dark with threads of gray in it, and it had not been trimmed recently. His coat was heavy canvas, worn soft with years, and his hat brim was low enough that Clara could not immediately read his eyes. She had never spoken to Wyatt Callahan directly. She had seen him, of course. Everyone in Red Hollow had seen Wyatt Callahan. In the way you saw a storm moving down from the North Ridge, you noticed it. You took note of it, and you made decisions accordingly. He came to town 3 or 4 times a year for supplies he couldn't produce on his ranch, and during those visits he spoke to almost nobody, and nobody much tried to speak to him, and then he was gone again, and people breathed a little easier. The stories about him were various, and not all of them agreed with each other. Some people said he had been a hired gun in his younger years. Some people said he had lost his family to fever and gone into the mountains to grieve and never come back. Some people said he was simply antisocial, or simply dangerous, or simply the kind of man civilization had no use for, and who had, reasonably enough, returned the favor. What everyone agreed on was that Wyatt Callahan did not stop for people. He was not stopping now exactly, but he had slowed. His eyes, she could see now that he was closer, were a dark gray-green, and they were looking at her with an attention that was different from the attention she usually received, which was either dismissive or pitying or both. This attention was direct and assessing without being unkind, and it did something unexpected to the air around her, which was already warm. "Miss Bennet," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, a voice accustomed to silence and therefore not in any rush to fill it. "Mr. Callahan," she said. She was proud of how steady her own voice came out. He stopped entirely. He had a canvas sack over one shoulder and a coil of rope on the other, and he set neither of them down, but he stopped and he looked at her for a moment that was longer than polite and shorter than rude. "You all right?" he said. It was such a simple question. It was the kind of question that should have been easy to answer, and Clara had been answering it with automatic ease for years. "Yes, thank you. Fine, just fine." She had it well practiced. It cost her nothing to say. What she said instead, for reasons she did not fully understand, was, "Not particularly." Wyatt Callahan did not look alarmed by this. He did not look sorry he had asked. He simply looked at her with that same direct attention and said, "Heard what Holt said in the store." The heat moved into her face. "Sound carries in this town," she said. "It does," he agreed. He did not add anything sympathetic to this observation. He did not tell her Gerald Holt was a fool, though if he thought it, Clara suspected the thought would have been accurate. He simply acknowledged that the thing had happened, and that he was aware of it, and there was something in that plain acknowledgement that was easier to bear than any amount of comfort offered in the usual Red Hollow fashion. "Well," Clara said. She shifted her basket to her other arm. "I appreciate your asking, Mr. Callahan." She began to walk back toward the street. "Miss Bennet, I have a proposition," he said. "It ain't charity. You should know that straight off, because I can see you'd throw charity back at a man's feet without a second thought, and I don't have patience for the conversation that would follow." Clara turned around slowly. "That's a very specific thing to say to someone you've spoken approximately 15 words to before today." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the implication of a smile, the way a cold morning sometimes implied a warmer afternoon without committing to it. "I pay attention," he said. "I've been in this town long enough today to know that Gerald Holt is a self-satisfied fool, that the women near the fabric bolts find other people's difficulties entertaining, and that you walked out of that store without giving a single one of them the satisfaction of watching you break. That tells me something about a person." Clara looked at him for a moment. "What does it tell you?" "That you've had practice," he said. "And that you're tired. And that you've got more sense than most of what walks through this town." "That last part might not be saying much," Clara said. This time his mouth moved a fraction further, closer to a real smile but still keeping its distance. "No," he said. "Might not. But I've got a ranch that's a mess and a set of records that haven't been properly managed in 3 years, and from what I understand, you know how to keep books." Clara had not expected any of that. She stood on the dusty ground behind the livery stable and looked at Wyatt Callahan and tried to determine whether she was being handled, which she was exceptionally sensitive to, or whether this man was simply as improbable as it seemed saying exactly what he meant. "Who told you I keep books?" she said. "Patterson," he said. "Before he married the schoolteacher, he mentioned you'd managed your father's affairs, and the Hendersons' accounts for 2 seasons running. Said you had an eye for patterns, and Patterson is the one who recommended me to you." "Patterson is the one who mentioned it," Wyatt said, and the distinction he drew between those two things was precise enough that Clara noted it. "I'm the one making the proposition." She was quiet for a moment. The street sounds continued beyond the livery voices, the clop of a horse being walked, the distant sound of someone hammering. Normal sounds of normal Red Hollow on a normal Tuesday morning in July in which, so far, she had been publicly humiliated, cried without crying, and been approached behind a livery stable by the most unsettling man in the territory. "What would it involve?" she said. 3 months, to start. "My records are a disaster. I've been running the ranch alone long enough that I've let the books go and been paying for it in ways I can't entirely account for. I need someone who can come in, make sense of what's there, set up a proper system going forward, and tell me where I'm losing money I shouldn't be losing." "And you'd want me to come to your ranch," Clara said. "That's where the records are," he said, not unreasonably. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I think you're aware that a woman coming to your ranch would give this town something to discuss for the remainder of the calendar year." "I'm aware," he said. "I also don't particularly care what this town discusses, and I have the impression you've been caring about it less every year." That was accurate. She found it slightly annoying that he had read her accurately. "What's the wage?" she said. He named a figure. Clara kept her expression neutral with some effort, because the figure he named was not what she had expected, and what she had expected had already been considerably more than she was currently making. "That's generous," she said, and she could not entirely keep the surprise out of her voice. "It's what the work is worth," he said simply. "I'm not in the habit of paying for less than I get, and I'm not in the habit of paying more. If you do the job, that's the wage." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "You should know that if there are problems in your records, I'll find them. And if I find them, I'll tell you about them, regardless of how uncomfortable that might be." "That's what I'm paying for," he said. "Some men don't actually want to know," Clara said. "They want someone to make the numbers look pleasant and not ask too many questions." "I want to know," Wyatt said, "even if it's unpleasant. Especially if it's unpleasant. Comfortable ignorance is how I ended up in the mess I'm in." She thought of her $7.40. She thought of the soft spot on the roof near the eastern corner. She thought of the Helena order and the passes in winter and the long arithmetic of survival that she had been doing alone for 7 years. "I'll need to arrange for my house," she said. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I come to town again in 2 weeks. If you've decided yes, be ready to ride out with the supply wagon. And if I've decided no, then you've decided no," he said. "I'll figure something else out." He said it without any edge to it, without any pressure. It was simply a statement of fact. She would decide, and either decision would be a decision, and he would proceed accordingly. There was something extraordinarily restful about this, Clara realized. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her as though her decisions were simply her decisions, without the weight of what those decisions meant for his feelings or her reputation, or the town's collective opinion, threaded through every word. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he confirmed. He resettled the canvas sack on his shoulder and the rope on the other, and he walked back the way he had come, and he did not look back, but he also did not seem to need to. Clara stood for another moment in the narrow passage between the livery and the fence. Then she picked up her basket and she walked home, and for the first time since she had walked out of Dawson's general store, she was thinking about something other than the sound of Gerald Holt's voice. She was thinking about patterns. The way Wyatt Callahan had said it, she had an eye for patterns. 3 years of unmanaged records. Losing money I can't entirely account for. Clara's mind, which was very good at this particular kind of thinking, began to work quietly and independently of the rest of her, as she walked the familiar road home through the summer heat. She did not tell anyone in Red Hollow what she was considering. This was not difficult. There was no one to tell. The 2 weeks passed the way July always passed in Montana, slowly and with heat that settled into the ground and radiated back up at you in the evenings. Clara prepared her house for a longer absence than she had ever arranged before. She asked old Mrs. Hartley next door to keep an eye on the garden and promised her a portion of the fall harvest in return. She arranged with the bank to hold any correspondence that arrived. She packed with the efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that what you could carry was more important than what you wished you had. She did not allow herself to think too carefully about what she was doing. If she thought too carefully about it, she would find 15 reasonable objections, and she had spent enough of her life being reasonable. On the appointed morning, she was standing in front of Dawson's when Wyatt's supply wagon came in from the north. She was wearing her good wool coat over her plain dress, and she had her traveling bag and her satchel with her notebooks and pencils. And she was standing with the careful composure of someone who is fully aware they are being watched and has decided that this awareness is no longer going to determine what they do. Because she was being watched, she could feel the eyes from the window of the mercantile, and from the steps of the hotel, and from the church door where someone had opened it exactly wide enough to see the street. Red Hollow did not miss much, and it did not miss this. Wyatt brought the wagon to a stop and got down from the box without hurrying. He looked at her bag and her satchel, and then at her face, and he said, "Ready?" "Ready," Clara said. He took her bag without being asked and put it in the wagon and offered her a hand up to the seat. Behind her, she heard a woman's voice say something low that was not meant to carry but did, the way voices in Red Hollow always did. She heard the words "no shame" and "poor thing," and "what does she think she's?" Wyatt heard it too. She could tell by the very slight change in his expression, the way the line of his jaw hardened almost imperceptibly. He was looking out toward the north road, not at the people watching, and he said quietly, so that only she could hear, "You don't have to listen to any of that." "I know," Clara said. "It gets easier," he said. He picked up the reins. "To not listen. It takes practice, but it gets easier." There was something in his voice that made her think this was not general advice. This was something he had learned himself in some long and private education that had cost him more than she currently knew. She looked at the road north, and she did not look back at Red Hollow. The ranch was 2 hours north of town, past the point where the valley opened up into wilder country, where the river narrowed and the pines came in thick on both sides of the trail. Clara had never been this far north. She had been born in Red Hollow and lived her whole life within walking distance of the center of town, and the mountains that rose behind Wyatt's territory were a landscape she knew only from what she could see from a distance. Up close, they were different from what she had imagined. Larger, obviously, but also more complicated. The way the ridgelines layered against each other, the way the shadow moved differently across different slopes, the way the road shifted from packed earth to loose shale to softer ground near the creek crossings. It required constant attention to navigate. And she noticed that Wyatt gave it that attention, quietly and without drawing any particular notice to the fact that he was doing so. They were not quiet during the journey, exactly, but they were not talkative either. They spoke when there was something to say and were silent when there wasn't, and Clara found, somewhat to her surprise, that this suited her. She was accustomed to silences that were filled with things left deliberately unsaid, with discomfort or expectation or judgment waiting beneath the surface. This silence was simply silence. When the ranch came into view around the last curve of the trail, Clara looked at it without saying anything for a moment. It was not what Red Hollow's stories had prepared her for. The stories had implied something grim and fortress-like, the refuge of a man who wanted walls between himself and everything else. What she saw was a working ranch in a state of managed disrepair, solid bones that had been allowed to deteriorate from neglect rather than intention. The main cabin was well built, heavy timber, chinked with care. The barn was sound. The fencing needed work in several places she could already identify from the trail. What she noticed most was the order that existed underneath the disorder. Things were not placed randomly. Things were placed where they would be most efficient to reach, where the light would hit them best, where they would be protected from the elements as well as possible, given the circumstances. Someone had thought carefully about the layout of this place. That same someone had then been too occupied with the actual work of running it alone to maintain it the way it deserved. "It's a good place," she said. Wyatt looked at her from the side. "It needs work. Most good places do," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The records are in the back room of the cabin. I'll warn you, they're not organized. I'd be unemployed if they were," Clara said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair point," he said. The back room was, as advertised, not organized. It was not chaotic in a random way, but rather in the way of a very busy person who had developed a personal system that made sense only to themselves, and had then stopped having time to maintain even that. There were 4 wooden crates of papers and ledgers and receipts and letters, some dating back nearly a decade. And there were 2 additional stacks of more recent documents that had not made it into any crate at all, but were simply piled on a table and weighted down with a rock. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at this for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to need more candles," Wyatt said from behind her. "To start Worth." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll get them." She brought one of the candles in from the main room and lit it and set it on the table and cleared a space next to weighted-down documents and sat down, and she began. She did not try to understand everything at once. She began the way she always began, which was at the oldest document she could find, and worked forward from there, building a picture in her mind as she went, noting things in her notebook. Placing papers into categories she was creating as she discovered what categories were needed. It was the kind of work she found deeply satisfying in a way she had never been able to fully explain to anyone, because most people found it tedious. But to her it felt like solving a puzzle where the picture on the front of the box had been lost, and you were discovering what the image was as the pieces came together. She worked for 3 hours before she stopped. When she came out of the back room, Wyatt was at the main fireplace, and the smell of something cooking filled the cabin, and Clara stood in the doorway and realized she had lost track of the time entirely. "You eat earlier or later?" he said, not looking up. "Earlier or later than what?" "Than now." "Now is fine," she said. The meal was simple and well made, which somehow surprised her less than it might have a week ago. She was discovering that Wyatt Callahan did most things with a quiet competence that required no announcement. He could write tick because he gave it to himself without needing it from anyone else. "I found something," she said, when they were nearly through the meal. He looked up. "It's early," she said. "I don't have enough of the picture yet to be certain. But I found a contract from 3 years ago, with a buyer named Nathaniel Crow for a cattle sale. The price listed is 15% below the going rate that year. Crow gives good prices on the purchasing side, Wyatt said. Or I thought he did. The going rate that year is available through the county records, Clara said. I know what it was, because I helped Mr. Dawson review his accounts 2 seasons ago. The price in your contract is not a good price. It's a low price that might look like a good price to someone who doesn't know what the comparison number should be. Wyatt's expression had gone very still. How many contracts with Crow are in those crates? I found 3 so far, Clara said. I haven't finished the first crate. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire moved and the shadows moved with it, and outside the window the dark of the Montana mountains was complete and thorough. How much difference are we talking about? He said. For the 3 contracts I've seen, across 3 years, roughly $400 below what you should have received. She watched his face. Wyatt Callahan was not a man whose face showed much. But something moved across it, at the number $400, not surprise, exactly, but a kind of heavy recognition. The look of a man who has suspected for some time that water has been getting into the walls, and is now hearing confirmation that the damage is worse than he hoped. He's been doing this to others, Wyatt said. It was not a question. I don't know yet, Clara said. I've only seen your records. But the structure of it, the way the number is wrong, in a way that requires specific knowledge to identify, that's not a mistake. That's a system. Systems don't get built for one transaction. Wyatt looked at her across the table. You found this in 3 hours, he said. I found a piece of it in 3 hours, Clara corrected. The rest will take longer. How much longer? However long it takes, she said. I don't rush patterns. They tell you what they have to tell you on their own schedule. He was quiet again. Then he said, I owe you an apology, Miss Bennett. Clara looked at him carefully. For what? For thinking this was going to be a straightforward bookkeeping job, he said. And for not realizing sooner that what I needed wasn't someone to organize papers. It was someone who could see what the papers were hiding. Clara looked at him across the table in the cabin on the mountain in the Montana dark, and she felt something unfamiliar settle over her, something she had not felt in a long time, something that was close to what people called being valued. I'll find the rest of it, she said. I know you will, Wyatt said. He said it as simply and completely as a man says something he has no doubt about. Clara picked up her fork and finished her meal, and outside the window the stars over the mountain were thick and brilliant, and entirely indifferent to the small drama of human beings inside the cabin below them. And inside Clara Bennett something that had been clenched tight and careful for a very long time relaxed, just slightly, for the first time in years. She did not yet know how deep the trouble went. She did not yet know that Nathaniel Crow had been watching Wyatt Callahan's ranch for longer than 3 years. She did not yet know that discovering what she had just discovered would make her a person Nathaniel Crow would need to silence. What she knew, in that moment, was that she had found work worth doing, in a place that needed her, beside a man who had looked at her behind a livery stable in the summer heat and seen something other than the woman 7 men had left behind. It was, for now, enough, and in the morning, she was going to go back into that back room and find the rest of it. She found the 4th contract on her 3rd morning at the ranch. She had been awake since before the light came, which was something that happened to her when a problem was unresolved. Her mind simply declined to stay unconscious when there was still work to do, and she had learned not to fight it but to use it. She lit her candle from the banked fire in the main room, careful not to wake Wyatt, whose boots she could see just inside the door of his room, and she went back into the back room and continued where she had left off. The 4th contract was tucked inside a folded land survey, which was why she had not found it in the first pass. It was dated 18 months ago. The cattle sale it described was larger than any of the previous 3, nearly twice the volume, and the price per head was listed at a number that made Clara's hand stop moving across the page. She sat very still for a moment. Then she opened her notebook and wrote the number down and put it beside the market rate she had already established from the county records. And she looked at the difference. It was not a mistake. There was no version of what she was looking at that could be a mistake. She put the pencil down and looked at the wall for a moment and thought about Nathaniel Crow, who she had seen exactly twice in her life. Both times he had been exactly what wealthy men in Montana in 1883 looked like when they wanted to be sure you knew they were wealthy: good coat, good boots, a certain way of occupying space as though it had been arranged for his convenience. She had not disliked him particularly because she had not thought about him enough to form an opinion. He was simply one of those men who existed at the outer edge of Red Hollow's social gravity, too important to need the town, but willing to pass through it when it served him. She thought about that now, the way he had smiled at people, the way he had shaken hands, the way a man who was systematically taking money from people who could not spare it would need to look, which was exactly like a man who was not doing that at all. She picked up the pencil. She kept working. By the time Wyatt knocked twice on the door frame, which was what he did instead of calling her name, a small consideration she had already noticed and catalogued, without making anything of it, she had found 2 more documents that concerned her, and the picture in her notebook had become significantly more detailed and significantly more alarming. "Coffee," Wyatt said. "Thank you," Clara said without looking up. He set the cup on the corner of the table where her elbow would not knock it over and stood for a moment in the doorway. "You found something else," he said. It was not a question. "I found several things," Clara said. She set her pencil down and looked at him. "Sit down, Mr. Callahan. This is going to take a few minutes." He came in and sat on the spare stool and looked at her with the same quality of attention he always gave her, which was complete and unperformed and slightly unnerving, in the way that full attention from someone who did not give it easily tended to be. She showed him the 4th contract. She showed him the 2 additional documents. She walked him through the numbers in her notebook, not rushing, not softening, not arranging the information to land more gently than it actually landed. Because she had told him from the beginning that she would tell him what she found, and she meant it. When she finished, Wyatt was quiet for a long time. "What's the total?" he said finally. Clara looked at her notebook. "Across all 6 documents, including the land lease adjustment in the last letter, you are short of what you should have received by just over $1,100. The silence that followed this was the kind of silence that had weight. $1,100 in 1883 in Montana was not an abstraction. It was a roof replaced and a barn repaired, and a season of hired hands and a cushion against the years
when they didn't date you, cattle prices dropped,
and the things you could not control conspired to strip away what you had built. It was the difference between a ranch that could absorb a bad year and a ranch that could not. Wyatt's jaw was tight. His hands were flat on his thighs and very still in the way hands sometimes got when a person was holding something in that they could not afford to let out. "He knew," Wyatt said. "He knew I wouldn't have the records in order to check." "Yes," Clara said. "He knew I didn't have anyone to check for me." "Yes." Wyatt looked at her. "How many other ranchers is he doing this to?" "I don't know yet," Clara said. "But I've been thinking about that. The Hendersons, the family whose accounts I managed for 2 seasons, I remember a contract with Crow in their records. At the time I didn't have any reason to look at it closely, but now that I know what the pattern looks like." "You think he's doing it to them too?" "I think it's possible," Clara said carefully. "I would need to see their records to know. But Mr. Callahan, if this is a system rather than an individual arrangement, and I believe it is a system, then the families it's being applied to are the ones who are least positioned to catch it. Smaller ranchers, people working alone, people who don't have someone going through their records." Wyatt looked at the papers on the table for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "How do you want to handle it?" she said. Clara blinked. In her experience, men who asked for her assessment of a situation did so with the clear implication that they would then determine how to handle it themselves. The direct question, "How do you want to?" was unusual enough that she needed a moment to recognize it for what it was. "I want to finish going through your records first," she said. "I want to make certain I have everything documented correctly and completely before we do anything else. A partial case is easier to dismiss than a complete one." "How long?" "Another 3 days, maybe 4. Then I'd like to verify what I remember about the Henderson records, if possible to arrange." "Tom Henderson and I have had no quarrel," Wyatt said. "I can ride down there." "I'd like to come," Clara said. He looked at her. "The Hendersons will trust what you tell them," she said. "But if there's a question about the numbers, I'm the one who can answer it. You'd be bringing me along as the person who actually found the pattern. That's worth more than a second-hand explanation." Wyatt considered this. "It's a 4-hour ride. I'm aware that I'm capable of a 4-hour ride," Clara said, and there was an edge in her voice that she did not try to soften, because she was tired of people who meant well cataloging her limitations. The corner of his mouth moved. "I didn't mean it that way." "How did you mean it?" "I meant that it's a long way to go if they're not home," he said. "I'll send word first." "Oh," Clara said. She looked back at her notebook. "That's reasonable. Most things I say are," Wyatt said. "I'm withholding judgment on that for now," Clara said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family as one, and then he picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the edge of the table and went out to start his morning work. And Clara picked up her pencil and went back to the records. The next 4 days were the most useful she had spent in years. She worked in the mornings before Wyatt was fully up, and in the evenings after supper, and in whatever hours fell between the other rhythms of the ranch. And the picture in her notebook grew and deepened and became more specific and more damning with every document she moved through. By the end of the 4th day, she had identified 9 separate transactions with Nathaniel Crow's business interests, all of them showing the same pattern of subtle mispricing that required specific market knowledge to recognize. All of them adding up to an accumulated shortfall that made her feel something cold and steady move through her when she looked at the final total. She also found something else. Something that was not in any of the documents with Crow's name on them, but which was in a letter filed incorrectly, tucked behind a lease agreement in the oldest crate, and which changed the shape of what she was looking at in a way that took her a full hour of sitting very still to fully comprehend. The letter was addressed to Wyatt. It was from a man named Aldous Pratt, identified in the letter itself as a land agent operating out of Helena. It was dated 4 years ago, and it described in careful and specific legal language a series of boundary adjustments to Wyatt's northern grazing land that had been filed with the county office in Wyatt's name, using documents he had not signed. Someone had filed land boundary changes on Wyatt's property without his knowledge. The signature on the filing documents as reproduced in the letter was close to Wyatt's but not identical. Clara, who had now spent 4 days reading Wyatt's handwriting on every kind of document, could see the difference clearly. It was a forgery. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went to find Wyatt. He was in the barn. The sound of the work stopped when she appeared in the doorway. "I need you to come look at something," she said. He read something in her voice. He came immediately. She showed him the letter. She showed him what she had recognized in the signature reproduction. She explained, slowly and clearly, what land boundary forgeries meant in terms of the legal structure of property ownership and what the practical consequences of such a filing would be. Wyatt did not speak for a long time after she finished. "The northern grazing land," he said. "I've been running shorter on it for 4 years. I thought it was the drought." "It wasn't the drought," Clara said. "Or not entirely. According to this, approximately 40 acres of your northern boundary were transferred, through this filing, to a holding company. I'd have to check the county records to identify who owns the holding company, but the letter implies it's connected to Pratt." "Who?" "Pratt works for Crow," Wyatt said. His voice was very flat and very quiet. Clara looked at him. "You know that?" Pratt sold Crow 3 properties in the valley over the past 6 years. It's common knowledge. He looked at the letter. I never connected it to my land because I thought my land was mine. It should be, Clara said. The filing is fraudulent. If we can prove the signature is forged, and I believe we can, with your actual handwriting for comparison, the transfer is invalid. The land would revert. How do you prove a forgery? Wyatt said. A handwriting examiner. A lawyer. The original filing documents from the county office. She paused. This isn't something we can handle on our own, Mr. Callahan. This is fraud. This is a crime. We need someone with legal authority. The county sheriff, Wyatt said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not confidence. Is there a problem with the sheriff? Clara said. Wyatt looked at her. Marcus Webb has had Sunday dinner at Nathaniel Crow's house every third week for the past 2 years. Clara was quiet for a moment. The territorial court, she said. Above the county level, federal authority. That's a longer road, Wyatt said. Yes, Clara said. But it's a road where Crow doesn't have his man at the end of it. Wyatt sat down on the edge of the workbench and looked at the floor for a moment, and Clara had the impression of someone, not in defeat but in calculation, running paths forward the way she ran numbers, checking each one for where it might give way. I know a man in Helena, he said. A lawyer. Not close, but he's honest, and he has no connections to Crow that I'm aware of. I trust him that far. Can you get a letter to him? I can ride there myself, Wyatt said. That would take most of a week, Clara said. You'd have to leave the ranch. I've left the ranch before, he said. Not while someone might have reason to notice that you've discovered something about their business, Clara said. She said it as plainly as she could, because she needed him to understand what she was actually saying. If Crow has been running this system for as long as the records suggest, he has been running it carefully. Carefully enough to use a forger. Carefully enough to keep a county sheriff comfortable at his dinner table. A man like that notices things. Wyatt looked at her. You're saying he might already be watching, he said. I'm saying it's possible, Clara said. I'm saying we should move carefully, and a lawyer's letter arriving here is easier to intercept than your feet walking into that man's office in Helena. He thought about this. I'll go, he said, but I'll go quietly. I've made that ride in other people's time. Nobody in this valley will think anything of Wyatt Callahan riding to Helena for supplies. What about the ranch while you're gone? He looked at her steadily. I was going to ask if you'd stay. Clara met his eyes. She was aware of what this meant, practically speaking. She was aware of what it would look like if anyone from Red Hollow happened to make inquiries. She was aware that a woman staying alone on a man's ranch while he was absent was exactly the kind of detail that spread through a small territory like ink through water. She was also aware that $1,100 and 40 acres of stolen land and a system designed to take from people who could not afford to lose sat in a stack of documents in the back room of this cabin, and that she was, at this particular moment, the person who understood it best. Yes, she said, I'll stay. Wyatt left 2 mornings later before the light came. He told her where the rifle was and how to work the latch on the barn door in cold weather, and which neighbor was closest if she needed anything, and he told her all of this with the same brisk efficiency he applied to everything, without making it feel like he was leaving her with a set of instructions she might not be capable of following. Before he rode out, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her. The records, he said. Keep working on them. If you find anything else. I'll document it, she said. Clara. It was the first time he had used her first name. They both registered it. He did not look away. Don't open the door to anyone you don't know, he said. I wasn't planning to, she said. And if Crow's man comes around, I'll be a hired housekeeper who knows nothing about anything, she said. I've been underestimated my whole life, Mr. Callahan. I know how to use it. Something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else she had a word for yet. Then he was gone, and the sound of his horse faded into the morning, and Clara was alone on the mountain. She worked. She also listened. The ranch was not silent during the day. There were the sounds of the animals and the wind and the normal creaking and shifting of any old structure that is alive in the way lived-in places are alive. She learned to separate these sounds from other sounds within the first 24 hours, because she was a woman alone at altitude, with a stack of documents that could ruin a powerful man, and she was not inclined to be careless about it. On the second day, she found what would later prove to be the most significant document in the entire collection. It was in the fourth crate, near the bottom, folded into thirds and sealed with a wax seal that had been broken and refolded at some point, probably years ago. It was from the county land office. It was a notice of pending consolidation inquiry regarding several properties in the Northern Valley corridor. Clara read it twice. Then she read it 3 more times. The notice described a process by which, if certain properties failed to demonstrate clear and uncontested ownership within a 12-month period, those properties would be subject to consolidation under county authority. The notice was dated 3 years ago. The 12-month window had closed 2 years ago. Clara's hands were very steady. Her mind was moving very fast. If Wyatt's boundary forgery had been filed for this notice, and she went back and checked the dates, and it had by 6 months then the consolidation inquiry period, Wyatt's northern 42 acres would have shown contested ownership, which meant the 40 acres might have been absorbed into county authority during the consolidation process without Wyatt ever knowing, because Wyatt had never received this notice, or had received it and not understood what it meant, or had received it and filed it away in the fourth crate near the bottom without reading it carefully, which was exactly the kind of thing that happened when one person was managing an entire ranch alone. She put the notice in a separate pile. She went back and found every document from that 3-year period and went through them again with this new context in place, and the picture changed further, deepened further, and became, if anything, more precise about what Nathaniel Crow had been doing and how long he had been doing it and how carefully the structure of it had been assembled. He had not simply been mispricing contracts. He had been creating conditions. The mispriced contracts reduced the financial cushion of ranchers who were already operating on thin margins. The boundary adjustments and forgeries created title disputes that could then be exploited through the consolidation process. The county consolidation process, Clara suspected strongly, had someone at its end who was not operating in the public interest. It was patient. It was deliberate. It was the work of a man who had decided, at some point, that he wanted the entire Northern Valley corridor and had constructed a quiet, legal-looking mechanism for taking it piece by piece over a decade. Clara sat with all of this for a long time. Then she put her pencil down and went to the window and looked out at the mountain, which was doing what mountains do regardless of human schemes, which is to say it was simply there, enormous and permanent and entirely unconcerned. She thought about the families it had been applied to. The Hendersons, who she had mentioned to Wyatt. The Garrity family, whose name appeared in 2 of Crow's contracts in Wyatt's records as third-party witnesses, a detail she had noted without understanding it, which now took on a different character. She thought about the Pollock Ranch south of the river, which had gone to consolidation last year, according to Red Hollow gossip, she had paid only half attention to at the time. She thought about all of them, and she felt something that was not anger, exactly, but was in the same territory as anger, something hot and specific and directed. She went back to work. On the evening of the 3rd day, she heard a horse on the trail. She went still, the latch on the barn door, the rifle. The distance to the nearest neighbor. She listened. One horse, moving at a walking pace, not hurrying, not attempting to approach quietly, which was either the mark of someone who had nothing to hide, or the mark of someone who wanted to appear that way. She moved to the window and looked. The man who rode into the yard was not Wyatt. He was younger than Wyatt, broad-shouldered, wearing a better coat than the work of this country required, and he looked at the cabin with an ease that was not the ease of someone who did not know where they were. He had been here before. Clara moved away from the window. She tucked her notebook under the mattress in her room. She straightened her apron. She thought briefly about the rifle, decided against it, because a housekeeper who greeted visitors with a rifle was not a housekeeper who knew nothing about anything. Then she opened the door. "Good evening," she said. She kept her voice mild and her hands loose at her sides. The man on the horse looked at her with the slight recalibration of someone who had not expected to find her there. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "I was looking for Callahan." "Mr. Callahan's away," Clara said. "He's expected back by end of the week." "And you are?" he said. Not rudely, just the direct inquiry of someone who felt his position entitled him to direct inquiries. "Clara Bennett," she said. "I'm hired help. Cooking and keeping the place while he's gone." She looked at him with the open, slightly simple expression she had found most useful in situations like this, interested without being curious, helpful without being informative. "Is there something I can pass along when he returns?" The man looked at the cabin, at the barn, at the yard in the way of someone taking an inventory. "I work for Mr. Crow," he said. "Nathaniel Crow." "You know the name?" "Yes, sir," Clara said. "Mr. Crow does business with Mr. Callahan." "Is it a business matter?" "Of a kind," the man said. He was still looking at the yard, not at her, which told her the yard interested him more than she did, which was good. "Mr. Crow has a proposition for Callahan about the northern acreage." "I'll let him know Mr. Crow's man came by," Clara said. "I'm sure he'll be in touch when he returns." The man looked at her then. Looked at her properly for the first time since she'd opened the door. She held his gaze with the placid patience of someone who had nothing interesting going on behind their eyes. He nodded slowly. "You do that," he said. He touched his hat brim and turned his horse. Clara watched him ride back down the trail. She waited until he was completely out of sight. Then she let out the breath she had been holding and went back inside and sat down at the table and pressed her hands flat against the wood and stayed like that for a moment. Crow's man had come about the northern acreage. The northern acreage that, according to the forged boundary filing, was no longer entirely Wyatt's. Crow did not send a man to discuss a proposition about land he had no interest in. Crow sent a man when he was ready to make a move. When he thought conditions were right. When he thought the person he was dealing with was either unaware of what was happening or too isolated to do anything about it. He thought Wyatt was unaware. He did not know about Clara. She got up from the table and went back into the back room and picked up her pencil. She was going to finish this before Wyatt came home, and she was going to have every number documented, and every document dated, and every piece of the pattern laid out in the clearest possible sequence. And when that lawyer in Helena read what she had put together, there was not going to be a single question she had not already answered. Clara Bennett had spent 27 years being underestimated. She had decided, somewhere in the hours she had spent alone on this mountain, that she was done treating that as something to endure, and ready to start treating it as the most useful tool she had. Crow had sent his man here thinking he was watching an empty ranch. He had no idea what he had walked past. She worked through the night. The candles Wyatt had brought burned down one by one, and she replaced them and kept going, and by the time the light started coming through the small window, she had finished the fourth crate. Documented everything in her notebook with dates and transaction references and comparison figures, and started on the final pile of unsorted papers. In the third-to-last document in that pile, she found the name she had been half expecting and wholly dreading. It was a letter. Not from Crow, not from Pratt. It was from a man named Lawrence Webb, the sheriff's brother, and it was addressed to Nathaniel Crow. And it was in Wyatt's papers because somewhere in the chain of transactions and manipulations and counter moves of the past 4 years, it had ended up misfiled in a document packet that had made its way into Wyatt's possession without anyone noticing. Clara read it once. She read it again. Then she stood up from the table, and she went to the window, and she looked at the mountain in the early morning light, and she understood fully and completely, and with a cold, clean clarity that this was larger than she had thought. larger than Wyatt had thought, larger than a lawyer in Helena was going to be sufficient to address. This was going to need federal authority, and federal authority was going to need evidence that was airtight, documented by someone who knew exactly what they were looking at, organized in a way that could not be dismissed or confused or quietly buried by anyone with a vested interest in burying it. It was going to need her, all of her, everything she had spent 27 years building in a town that never looked at her long enough to see it. She picked up her pencil. She started on the final stack. Wyatt came home on the morning of the 6th day, which was 1 day later than he had estimated, and Clara heard his horse on the trail, and came out of the back room and was standing in the doorway of the cabin when he rode into the yard. He looked at her across the distance between them, with the particular attention of a man who has been gone 6 days and has spent some portion of those days thinking about what he left behind. He got down from the horse. "You're all right," he said. "I'm fine," Clara said. Wyatt went very still. "3rd day," she said. "A man working for him. He asked about the northern acreage." "What did you tell him?" "That you were expected back by end of the week, and I'd pass along that he'd stopped by," Clara said. "He thought I was hired help. He wasn't interested in me." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "They never are," he said. And the way he said it was neither a complaint nor a compliment, but something more careful than either, something that understood exactly what she had done and what it had cost her to do it. "Mr. Callahan," Clara said, "come inside. I need to show you what I found while you were gone." He came inside. She showed him the letter with Lawrence Webb's name on it. She watched his face change, and then she told him everything. When she finished, the fire had burned down and the morning had moved into afternoon, and Wyatt sat across the table from her, with the look of a man who has been shown the full scale of something he knew was bad but had not understood was this bad, and he was quiet for a long time. "Clara," he said. She waited. "What you put together here," he said. He stopped. He looked at the notebook, at the stacked documents, at the careful system she had built out of 4 crates of chaos. "I need you to understand something." "All right," she said. "Nobody in this valley," he said, "has ever done something like this for me. Nobody has ever sat down with a stack of papers and a candle and spent a week finding the truth of something and laid it out the way you've laid this out." Clara was quiet. "I'm not saying it to flatter you," he said. And his voice was rough with something that was not anger and not grief, but was somewhere between the two in the territory of a man who has been alone long enough that gratitude has become a complicated thing to express. "I'm saying it because I think you should know that what you did matters. And that I see it." She had heard many things said to her in 27 years. She had heard kind things and unkind things and dismissive things and pitying things and flattering things that were designed to get something from her rather than give anything to her. She could not remember the last time someone had said something to her that was simply, straightforwardly, without any other agenda, "I see it." The lawyer, she said, because she needed to say something practical before the moment became something she was not ready for. "Did you reach him?" "I did," Wyatt said. "He's coming here in 2 weeks. He wants to see the records himself." He paused. "When I described the situation, he said what you said. Federal authority. He has a contact at the territorial court." 2 weeks, Clara said. She looked at the notebook. "I'll have everything organized before he arrives." "I know you will," Wyatt said. He said it the same way he had said it before, with the same quality of simple certainty that made the words feel like something other than a compliment. Like a fact, like something that was simply true. And then, from outside, clearly and without any ambiguity, came the sound of more than one horse on the trail below. Not Wyatt's lawyer, who was 2 weeks away. Not a single rider making a casual inquiry about the northern acreage. Multiple horses. Moving with purpose, Wyatt was on his feet before Clara finished registering the sound. He went to the window. 3 riders, he said. His voice was completely even. "I don't know the 2 on the outside. The one in the middle is Webb." "The county sheriff." Clara looked at the table. at the notebook, at the stack of documents that included a letter with Lawrence Webb's brother's name on it and Nathaniel Crow's name on it, and enough detail about what they had been doing together to end both of their positions in this territory permanently. She looked at Wyatt. "How much time do we have?" she said. 2 minutes, he said. "Maybe less." Clara picked up the notebook. She picked up the letter with Webb's name on it, and 4 of the most significant documents in the stack. She went to her room. She was back in 60 seconds. The table looked like a woman had been organizing a household ledger and stepped away from it. There was nothing on it that told a story about anything except ordinary domestic accounting. "Where?" Wyatt said. "Somewhere they won't think to look," Clara said. He looked at her for one moment with an expression she did not have time to fully read. Then he went to the door, and she went back to the kitchen area, and outside the sound of the 3 horses was very close now, and Wyatt Callahan opened the door to the county sheriff and the 2 men who were not the county sheriff and said, in the steady, unhurried voice of a man who had nothing to apologize for, "Webb." "This is unexpected." Clara kept her hands busy with something ordinary. She did not look at the door. She listened to everything. Sheriff Marcus Webb stepped through the door of Wyatt Callahan's cabin like a man who had been given permission he had not actually asked for. And the 2 riders behind him followed with the particular ease of men who understood that their authority in any room came from the man in front of them. Webb was not a large man. He was average in almost every physical dimension: average height, average weight, a face that was forgettable in the way of faces that have spent years perfecting the art of revealing nothing. He had been sheriff of Red Hollow County for 11 years, and in 11 years he had developed the professional calm of someone who had learned that projecting certainty was more effective than actually possessing it. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Clara. He looked at the table. "Callahan," he said, "didn't know you had company." "Hired help," Wyatt said. The word was easy in his mouth, completely without any edge that might suggest it was anything other than what it sounded like. "You've come a long way from town, Marcus. Something I can do for you?" Webb moved to the table without being invited. He looked at the papers on it, the ordinary household ledger that Clara had arranged in 60 seconds to look like 60 hours of unremarkable domestic accounting. He picked up one page and looked at it and set it back down. Clara did not stop what she was doing in the kitchen area. She moved carefully, unhurriedly, the way a woman who had been hired to cook and clean would move when the man of the house had unexpected visitors. She was aware of both men behind Webb, watching her with the passive attention of guards stationed at a door, and she was aware that the most important thing she could do right now was give them nothing interesting to look at. "Had a report," Webb said, "that there's been some activity up here. People coming and going." "I went to Helena for supplies," Wyatt said. "That a concern. Depends who you were seeing in Helena," Webb said. Wyatt looked at him steadily. "I saw the supply merchant, the feed store, and an old friend who I had supper with." "You want their names?" Webb turned from the table and looked at him. The professional calm was still in place, but, underseatedly, Clara could hear something that was more like an inquiry than a casual visit. Something that had purpose. "Nathaniel Crow sent word," Webb said. "He's looking to finalize that land arrangement on your northern boundary. Thought it might be easier if we came up and had a conversation rather than letting things sit." "What land arrangement?" Wyatt said. "The consolidation matter," Webb said. "From the county process 2 years back. There's some outstanding business that Crow is positioned to resolve, if you're amenable." Clara kept her hand steady. She was washing a cup that was already clean. She washed it again. Wyatt looked at Webb with an expression that was exactly the expression of a man who was hearing about a matter he was not fully clear on, which was a look that required genuine skill to produce, when you were actually the man who now knew precisely how much of his land had been taken, and by what mechanism. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Wyatt said. "My land is my land," the Northern 40, Webb said. "There's a title question from the consolidation period. Crow's prepared to offer a fair price to resolve it cleanly, rather than let it sit in the county records indefinitely. Wyatt said. Webb named a figure. It was a low figure. It was the kind of figure that a man might accept if he did not know the land was worth significantly more. If he did not know the title question had been manufactured. If he did not know that the consolidation process had been guided by hands with an interest in the outcome. That's generous of Mr. Crow, Wyatt said. His tone was perfectly neutral. He's a fair businessman, Webb said. Clara put the clean cup on the shelf and picked up another one. I'd want to look into the title matter myself before I agreed to anything, Wyatt said. Seems reasonable to understand what I'm agreeing to. Of course, Webb said. No rush. Crow just wanted to open the conversation. He paused. You planning to be in town this week? Not that I know of, Wyatt said. Crow will be at the hotel through Friday if you want to talk directly. Webb picked up his hat from where he'd set it. Who's the woman? He said. He said it the way people sometimes asked about furniture, not impolitely, but without any particular sense that the furniture had ears. Clara Bennett, Wyatt said. From Red Hollow. She's here to get the household in order. She'll head back to town in a few weeks. Webb looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him with the open, mild expression she had used on Crow's man. She said, "Good afternoon, Sheriff," in a voice that belonged entirely to a woman whose most pressing concern was the cleanliness of the cup in her hand. Webb nodded at her the way people nodded at furniture. Then he put his hat on and walked back out the door, and the two men behind him followed, and the sound of 3 horses leaving the yard was the most welcome sound Clara had heard since Wyatt's horse on the trail that morning. Neither she nor Wyatt spoke until the sound was completely gone. Then Wyatt closed the door and leaned against it and let out a long, slow breath. He knows something, he said. He suspects something, Clara said. She set down the cup. If he knew, he wouldn't have come himself. He'd have had reason to come differently. Crow sent him to test the temperature, Wyatt said. Yes. He wants to know how much you know about the northern land before he decides how to move. Clara looked at the table. If you'd shown any awareness of the forgery, this conversation would have gone a different direction. But I didn't. No, Clara said. You didn't. Wyatt looked at her across the room. You didn't move a muscle, he said, standing there washing that cup. I was listening, she said. I know, he said. That's what I mean. She went to her room and retrieved the notebook and the 4 documents and the letter with Webb's name on it, and brought them back to the table and set them down, and they sat together and went through everything she had found while he was gone. And Wyatt was quiet in the way he was always quiet when he was thinking, which was completely and without any of the fidgeting or deflecting that most people used to fill the space while their minds worked. When she finished laying it all out, he put his hands flat on the table and looked at the letter with Lawrence Webb's name on it for a long moment. His brother, he said. Named specifically in relation to the consolidation filings, Clara said. He's a land records clerk at the county office. He would have had access to the filing system. Lawrence Webb filed the forged boundary change, Wyatt said. Or facilitated it, Clara said. Either way, it explains how the filing passed through without triggering any inquiry. Someone on the inside made sure it was processed without question. Wyatt sat back. So the sheriff's brother is dirty, which means the sheriff is either dirty or being protected by someone he loves enough to look the other way. Or both. Wyatt agreed. He was quiet again. Then the lawyer I saw in Helena. His name is Samuel Garrett. He's been in practice for 20 years, and he has a reputation for going after cases other lawyers won't touch. When I told him the outline of what you'd found, he didn't hesitate. He said if the documentation is what I described, it's a federal fraud case, possibly conspiracy. He's right, Clara said. He asked me if the person who compiled the records would be available to speak to a federal examiner, Wyatt said. He looked at her directly. I told him I'd ask. Clara looked at the notebook on the table. At 27 years of being underestimated and overlooked and left behind and all of it, Every quiet, painful year of it. Collecting into this moment where the skills everyone had dismissed were the exact skills that could undo what Nathaniel Crowe had spent a decade building. Yes, she said. Tell him yes. The next 2 weeks were a different kind of work. Not the solitary, candlelit work of sorting and documenting and discovering. This was the work of preparation, of taking what she knew and organizing it into something that could survive scrutiny, that could withstand the kind of legal examination designed to find the flaws in an argument and pull those flaws until the whole structure came apart. Clara was meticulous. She created 2 complete copies of her documentation, one in her clearest handwriting, organized chronologically, with cross-references and a summary index that described what each document showed and why it was significant. She kept the original documents in the order she had found them, because the context of where something had been filed and what it had been filed with was itself part of the story. She also rode out with Wyatt to the Henderson ranch. The ride took 4 hours and was made mostly in the practical silence she had come to understand, was simply how Wyatt moved through the world, not anti-socially, but efficiently, conserving words for when they were needed. When they did talk, it was about the case, about what they might find in Henderson's records, about how to approach the conversation without alarming Tom Henderson before they had something concrete to show him. He's a careful man, Wyatt said. Not suspicious by nature, but careful. If you come at him with theories, he'll shut down. I don't have theories, Clara said. I have specific numbers and specific dates. That's a different conversation. You lead it then, Wyatt said. She looked at him. He was watching the trail ahead, and his profile in the afternoon light was the profile of a man who had genuinely meant what he just said, who was not managing her or accommodating her, but simply recognizing where the competence in this particular situation resided and deferring to it without making anything of the deference. She looked at the trail ahead. All right, she said. Tom Henderson was a large, slow-talking man who had the quality of many outdoor men, seemingly unhurried in manner while being very fast in actual response when something demanded it. He heard Clara out with his arms crossed and his eyes on the papers she'd spread on his kitchen table when she finished explaining what the pattern looked like in Wyatt's records and what she needed to look for in his. The silence that followed had a particular character. How long would you need, he said. A day, Clara said. Maybe 2. Henderson looked at Wyatt. She's thorough, Wyatt said. Henderson looked at Clara again, with the evaluating look of a man who had spent his life assessing the reliability of things. Then he nodded. The records are in the chest by the window, he said. My wife helps me keep them. She could help you find what you're looking for faster. I'd welcome that, Clara said. Mary Henderson was a small, quick-moving woman with sharp eyes and the economical manner of someone who had learned to read situations fast because survival in this territory depended on it. She sat beside Clara for the better part of 2 days and handed documents and answered questions and, about 6 hours into the first day, said quietly, I always felt something was wrong with those Crowe contracts. Tom said I was being suspicious without cause. You weren't being suspicious without cause, Clara said. You were seeing a pattern you didn't have the comparison figures to name. Mary Henderson looked at the numbers Clara had written in her notebook. How much, she said. Clara showed her. The number was smaller than Wyatt's, but significant for a family operating on tighter margins. Mary Henderson did not cry. She pressed her lips together and looked at the wall for a moment, and then she said, What do we do? And the steadiness in her voice was the steadiness of a woman who had survived enough to know that what you did after the shock mattered more than the shock itself. You let me finish documenting this, Clara said, and then you let a federal lawyer see it. And that works, Mary said. That actually works against a man like Crowe? Clara met her eyes. It works if the evidence is airtight, she said. I intend for it to be airtight. 3 other families. In the weeks that followed, through a network of conversations that moved carefully and quietly through the Northern Valley, Clara documented the same pattern in 3 additional sets of records. Each family's situation was different in its particulars and identical in its structure. Each family had been losing money they could not account for. Each family had a crow contract with pricing that looked reasonable and wasn't. 2 of the 5 families had boundary irregularities similar to Wyatt's. And every family, when Clara explained what she had found, said some version of the same thing. They said, "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to see it." She knew exactly what that felt like. Samuel Garrett arrived at Wyatt's ranch on a Thursday morning 17 days after Wyatt had visited him in Helena. He was a compact, precise man of about 50, with the habit of looking at documents the way Clara looked at documents, as things that told stories if you knew how to listen, and within 2 hours of sitting with her organized evidence. He looked up across the table and said, "Miss Bennett, this is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases I have seen assembled outside of a formal legal proceeding." "Is it sufficient?" Clara said. "For a federal filing, yes." "For an investigation." He looked at the letter with Lawrence Webb's name on it. "This alone is sufficient to involve the territorial marshal." "How long does that process take?" Wyatt said from the other side of the table. "The filing, not long. The investigation, several months. A trial, if it comes to that, longer." Garrett looked at both of them. "In the meantime, I have to be direct with you about something. Once we file, Crow will know. He will know it came from someone with access to these records, and he will not have trouble identifying whose ranch those records came from." "I know," Wyatt said. "He has resources," Garrett said. "And he has at minimum one person in the county structure who has been working on his behalf. The period between filing and the arrival of federal authority is the period of greatest risk." The room was quiet. "How long is that period?" Clara said. "If I ride to the territorial court directly from here, 2 weeks. Possibly 3. Wyatt looked at Clara. Clara looked at Garrett. "File it," she said. Wyatt looked at her for a moment longer. "File it," he said. Garrett left the next morning with a copy of everything, organized in the leather satchel Clara had prepared, every document numbered and cross-referenced, every comparison figure sourced and explained. Everything structured so that a federal examiner encountering it cold could follow the full story without a single gap. That afternoon, Clara was standing at the window when she heard Wyatt behind her. You should have been a lawyer," he said. "They don't accept women," she said, without turning from the window. "They're wrong not to," he said. She turned then, because the directness of it surprised her. He was leaning against the doorframe, with his arms crossed. And he was not saying it to be kind, and not saying it to flatter her, and not saying it with any of the quality that the men in Red Hollow had when they said something meant to establish their own generosity. He was saying it the way he said most things, which was simply because it was true, and he saw no reason not to say it. "You might be the only person in this territory who has ever said that to me," Clara said. "Then this territory is less intelligent than it thinks it is," Wyatt said. She looked at him for a moment. "You're not what I expected," she said. "When I agreed to come here, you're not what anyone in Red Hollow thinks you are." "What did they think I was?" he said. It was a genuine question, not a vain one. "Someone without a heart," she said. "Someone who left because he didn't care about anything." Something moved through his expression. Not pain exactly. "The memory of pain, which is a different thing. I left because I cared too much," he said. "About the wrong things, or about the right things in a way that didn't have anywhere to go." He looked at the floor for a moment. "When you lose people, the thinking goes that if you don't let anything close enough, you can't lose it. It's not good thinking, but it's the thinking you do when you're not in a position to think clearly." "Who did you lose?" Clara said. She asked quietly, because it was a quiet kind of question. He was still for a moment. "My wife," he said, "and our son. Fever. 7 years ago. The room held that." "I'm sorry," Clara said. It was not enough, it was never enough. That phrase, but it was real, and she meant it completely. "I came up here because I didn't know what else to do," Wyatt said. And then it turned into years. And after enough years, it started to feel like not what I wanted, but what I was. A man on a mountain, Clara said. A man on a mountain, he agreed, who everybody thought was dangerous. Are you, Clara said. The corner of his mouth moved. To people who've earned it, he said. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had been avoiding doing with any real directness since she'd arrived. Because she was a practical woman and she was here for a purpose, and she had not come here to feel things that would complicate a situation that was already complicated. But she looked at him now, at the lines around his eyes and the gray in his beard and the hands that were scarred from years of solitary work, and she thought about what he had said. I left because I cared too much, and she felt something. She felt something very specific and not at all convenient. She looked back out the window. The families, she said. The ones we documented. They're in as much risk as you are once the filing goes in. I know, Wyatt said. His voice had shifted back into the practical register, which she was grateful for. I've already sent word. They know to be watchful. Tom Henderson's got 2 sons who are not small men. And us? We're watchful, Wyatt said. And we're not without resources. He paused. I've sent word to 2 men I trust. They'll be here by end of the week. You have men you trust? Clara said. 2, he said, which is 2 more than most people in this territory have. She almost smiled at that. That's a very specific number. I'm a specific man, he said. The end of the week came, and with it, Wyatt's 2 trusted men, a pair of weathered, quiet individuals named Cal and Dutch, arrived together on matched horses and asked nothing about why they had been summoned and required no explanation beyond what Wyatt gave them, which was brief and to the point. They settled into the barn without complaint. They were useful with the ranch work and unobtrusive about the rest. And their presence changed the quality of the air on the property, in a way that Clara recognized without being able to fully name the way the presence of reliable people always changed the quality of a place, making it feel less exposed. On the 9th day after Garrett's departure, Nathaniel Crow himself came to the ranch. Not his man, not the sheriff. Crow himself. Clara heard the horses from the back room and came out and looked at Wyatt, and Wyatt looked at her, and the message that passed between them in that look was complete and required no words. She went back into the back room and closed the door most of the way, not all the way, because she needed to hear, and she stood very still. She heard Wyatt open the door. Mr. Crow, Wyatt said. I was wondering when you'd come yourself. Nathaniel Crow's voice was exactly what she expected from a man who had built what he had built, smooth, reasonable, carrying just enough warmth to imply friendliness, without committing to it. Callahan, I hope you'll forgive the unannounced visit. I find direct conversations are usually more productive than going back and forth through intermediaries. Sit down, Wyatt said. His voice was measured. Not warm, but not hostile. The voice of a man conducting a business conversation. Clara heard the sound of chairs. The sound of a third-person. Crow had brought someone settling against the wall. I'll be direct, Crow said. I know you've been looking into your records. I know you've been asking questions about the consolidation process. And I want you to know that I understand why I'd do the same in your position. But I think if you talk to a lawyer, what he'll tell you is that the title situation on your northern land is genuinely complicated, and that the most practical resolution is also the one I'm offering. Which is to sell you land that's mine, Wyatt said. Which is to resolve a contested title situation in a way that's clean for both parties, Crow said. I'll improve the offer. I'm prepared to go substantially higher than what I sent Webb to propose. He named a new figure. It was higher. It was still not close to what the land was worth. And it was offered with the smooth confidence of a man who expected the conversation to end here, who expect a man living alone in the mountains to take what was on the table and be grateful. That's a better offer, Wyatt said in a tone that gave nothing away. I thought you'd see it that way, Crow said. I'd want it in writing, Wyatt said. Of course, Crow said. I have the paperwork with me. There was a pause. Then Wyatt said, "Before I sign anything, I'd like to understand the consolidation filing better. Can you walk me through what happened from the county side?" Another pause. Shorter. "It's fairly standard county procedure," Crow said. "When titles are disputed during a consolidation period." "Who filed the boundary change?" Wyatt said. The pause this time was different. It was the pause of a man recalibrating. "It would have gone through the county land office," Crow said. "Lawrence Webb," Wyatt said. The silence that followed was the silence of a room in which someone has just confirmed that the person they are speaking to knows more than they believed. Clara pressed her hand against the wall to her left and breathed very carefully. "I don't know the names of every county clerk," Crow said. His voice had not changed in any way that anyone without very good ears would have noticed. But Clara's ears were very good. The warmth was gone from it. What remained was the smooth reasonableness stripped down to its actual mechanism. "I think you do," Wyatt said. "I think you know Lawrence Webb very well. I think you know Marcus Webb through his brother, and I think you've known both of them for a long time." "Callahan." Crow's voice had shifted again, lower now, quieter, and underneath the quiet was the particular quality of a man, indicating that a line has been reached. "I came here in good faith, did you?" Wyatt said. "It was not a question. I came here to offer you a clean resolution to a complicated situation. I'd encourage you to take it. People who don't take clean resolutions sometimes find situations become less clean." The room was very still. Clara did not move. Wyatt said. "I'm being practical," Crow said. "You're one man on a mountain. I have interests across this entire territory. That's not a threat. That's geography." "It's geography," Wyatt said. He said it in a voice that was so calm it was almost gentle. "Then I'll tell you something about geography, Mr. Crow. The territorial court is in Helena. That's one day's ride from here. A federal examiner is closer than geography might make it seem." The silence this time lasted 4 full seconds. "You filed," Crow said. And now the smooth warmth was completely absent. What was left was the flat voice of a man who has just understood that what he came here to prevent has already happened. "Samuel Garrett filed," Wyatt said. 8 days ago." Another silence. "That was a mistake," Crow said. "A very significant mistake, was it?" Wyatt said. Clara heard the sound of chairs moving, the sound of 2 men standing. And then Crow's voice, still controlled, still professional, but carrying something underneath it that was no longer the implication of a threat, but the thing itself. "I want you to think very carefully about the next several weeks, Callahan. Think about your property. Think about your animals. Think about the people who've been spending time up here." A pause. "Some things don't wait for federal examiners. Then the door. Then the horses. Then gone." Clara came out of the back room. Wyatt was standing at the window. His back was to her. His hands were at his sides, and the line of his shoulders was the line of a man holding himself very still, because the alternative to stillness was something he could not afford right now. "He knows," Wyatt said. "He'll move fast now." Yes, she came to stand beside him at the window. Not close enough to be anything but present. Just present. "The thing he said at the end," she said. "Think about the people who've been spending time up here." She kept her voice steady. "He meant me." Wyatt turned from the window and looked at her. His expression was not the expression she had seen in any of their previous conversations. It was something else, something that was very direct and very unguarded and carried a weight that had nothing to do with the case or the documents or the federal examiner in Helena. "I know," he said. "I'm not leaving," Clara said. He looked at her. "I know what he was implying," she said. "I'm not leaving." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said, "you came here for a bookkeeping job." "I stayed for something more important than that," she said. She held his gaze because she meant it completely, and she wanted him to know that she meant it. Those 5 families. The evidence that took 3 weeks to compile. Everything Garrett has in his satchel right now, on the way to the territorial court. If I leave, none of it changes, but it would feel like leaving. You could be in danger, he said. I've been in danger since the day I found the fourth contract, she said. I just didn't name it until now. He looked at her for a long time. All right, he said finally. His voice was quiet. Then we prepare. What does that mean? It means I send word to Cal and Dutch. It means I write to Garrett again and tell him we need the federal examiner to move faster than 2 weeks. It means I send word to Tom Henderson and the other families to stay close to home and stay armed. He paused. And it means tonight I move what's left of your documentation to a place where it can't be reached without someone knowing about it. Where? Clara said. I know a place, Wyatt said. On the North Ridge. I've kept certain things there before. Things I needed to be sure of. Clara nodded. And one more thing, Wyatt said. He was still looking at her, and the quality of his attention was the same quality it had been when he first stopped behind that livery stable in Red Hollow on a hot July morning, except that now she understood what it meant. She had spent enough weeks in close proximity to a man who did not waste his attention to know that when Wyatt Callahan looked at someone the way he was looking at her, it was not incidental. When this is finished, he said, when Garrett's done and the examiner's done, and Crow is answering for what he's done, he stopped. Started again. I'd like to talk to you about something that's got nothing to do with records or boundary filings or federal examiners. Clara looked at him. I reckon you know what I mean, he said. He was not entirely comfortable saying it. She could see that. He was a man who had spent 7 years not saying things to anyone, and the practice of it had made him careful with words the way some people were careful with money, spending them only when the value was certain. She felt the warmth of what he was saying move through her, and it was real and not convenient, and she was not sure she was ready for it, but she was also absolutely certain that she was not going to pretend she did not understand him. I know what you mean, she said. All right, he said. All right, she said. And outside, the Montana mountains stood exactly as they had stood for 10,000 years before Nathaniel Crow or Wyatt Callahan or Clara Bennett had ever set foot in them. And somewhere on a road that led from a mountain ranch to a territorial court, a lawyer named Samuel Garrett was riding with a leather satchel that contained, among other things, the clearest and most complete account of what Crow had done that had ever been assembled on paper. And in Red Hollow, 30 miles south, in a room at the hotel that faced the main street, Nathaniel Crow sat across a table from Marcus Webb and said, very quietly, we have a problem. And the problem has a name, and the name is Clara Bennett. The word reached Clara through Mary Henderson, who sent her oldest boy on a fast horse 2 days after Crow's visit to the ranch. The boy arrived before breakfast, his horse breathing hard, and he handed Clara a folded note without getting down from the saddle. She read it standing in the yard with Wyatt beside her, and what it said was this: Crow's men had been to 3 of the 5 families the night before. Not to threaten, to offer. Each family had received a visit from a man carrying a document and a sum of cash money, and an explanation that the contested land matter could be resolved quietly and immediately if they would simply sign. 2 families had signed. Clara folded the note and handed it to Wyatt. He read it without expression. Then he looked at the Henderson boy. Your mother and father, they didn't sign? No, sir, the boy said. Papa said to tell Mr. Callahan they're holding. Tell your father I'll be in touch before nightfall, Wyatt said. And ride home the back way. You understand. The boy nodded and turned the horse and went. Wyatt looked at the note again, then at Clara. He's moving faster than we thought, she said. He's panicking, Wyatt said. That's different from moving fast. Is it better or worse, said. A panicked man makes mistakes. He also does damage while he's making them. 2 families had signed. That meant 2 families had formally settled their land disputes with Crow, which meant those particular threads of evidence had just become significantly more complicated. Not impossible, but complicated. A signed settlement agreement was a document that a capable lawyer could use to argue resolution. to argue that the families had accepted the terms voluntarily, to muddy the picture that Clara had spent weeks making clear. She said this to Wyatt and watched him think about it. "Garrett needs to know," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "And the federal examiner needs to move before any more families sign." She went inside and wrote 2 letters, one to Garrett describing what had happened and what it meant for the evidence. One to the territorial court directly, addressed to the federal examiner Garrett had named in his last communication, explaining the situation in precise legal language that she had been absorbing and using for weeks, and which now came to her as naturally as the accounting terminology she had grown up with. She gave both letters to Cal, who rode for Helena before the morning was fully established. Then she went back to work. What she did in the hours that followed was something she had not previously done, not because she lacked the ability, but because she had not until now understood it was necessary. She sat down with her notebook and she wrote, from memory, a complete narrative account of everything she had found, everything she had observed, and everything that had happened since she arrived at Wyatt's ranch. She wrote it in plain language, in chronological order, with specific dates and specific names and specific amounts. And she wrote it as though she were explaining the situation to someone who had never heard of Nathaniel Crow, or Red Hollow, or the Northern Valley Corridor. She wrote it because 2 families had signed documents, and the evidence picture was now changed, and what she needed to make sure existed was a record of what the picture had looked like before it was changed. A record written by the person who had assembled the picture in the first place. She wrote for 4 hours without stopping. When she set her pencil down, Wyatt was in the doorway. "Eat something," he said. "In a minute," she said. "Now," he said. He said it without authority and without softness. He said it the way he said most things, which was simply and directly, as a statement of what he thought she needed, leaving the decision entirely with her. She ate. At the table, with food in front of her and the notebook closed and the afternoon coming through the window, she felt the accumulated exhaustion of the past weeks settle onto her the way weight settles gradually at first and then all at once. "You've been awake since before the Henderson boy came," Wyatt said. "I know," she said. "You're allowed to stop for an hour," he said. "Crow isn't stopping," she said. "Crow isn't going to break this by working harder than you," Wyatt said. "He's going to try to break it by making you make a mistake." "Tired people make mistakes," she looked at him. "Sleep," he said. "I'll watch." She slept for 2 hours in the afternoon, which was not something she had done since she was a child sick with fever, and when she woke she felt the specific alertness of a mind that has been given what it needed and is ready to work again. Wyatt was at the table when she came out. He had a cup of coffee and a piece of paper in front of him and was writing something in the slow, deliberate handwriting of a man who was careful with it because he had not had a great deal of formal schooling and understood that precision cost him more effort than it cost some people. "What is that?" she said. "A list," he said. "Of what?" "Everything Crow has done to this ranch since I've owned it," he said. "Not the records. My memory. Every conversation, every interaction, every time I saw the man or one of his representatives and what was said." Clara sat across from him. "That's valuable," she said. "I thought it might be," he said. "You made me think of it, with what you wrote this morning. If we're building a picture for people who weren't here, then my memory is part of the picture." She looked at the paper. His handwriting was large and careful, and the list was longer than she would have expected. Because Wyatt's memory, she was discovering, was the same quality as his attention, complete and specific and not inclined to let go of things. "The first time Crow approached me about the northern land," he said, not looking up from the page, "was 4 years ago. He came up here himself, the way he came this week, and made an offer that I didn't think twice about turning down, because at the time I didn't know I was supposed to be suspicious of it. I thought he was just a businessman making an investment inquiry." He paused. "I was wrong about that. You had no reason to be suspicious," Clara said. "I had a feeling," he said. "I remember the feeling." It was the kind of feeling you learn to pay attention to, and then ignore because paying attention to it makes life complicated. He set the pencil down. I should have paid attention. You couldn't have known what it meant without the records, Clara said. You figured it out in 3 hours, he said. I had context you didn't have, she said. I knew what the market rate was that year because I'd worked with it. You're not being fair to yourself. He looked at her. Are you defending me to myself? Apparently, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. That's new, he said. Don't get accustomed to it, she said. I have a limited supply. He looked at her for a moment more, and in his expression was the thing she had been seeing more frequently as the weeks passed, the warmth that was not performed, not designed to get anything, but simply there, the way things are there when they are real. And alongside it, something that was older and more careful, the wariness of a man who had been without this for long enough that the presence of it felt both necessary and slightly dangerous. She understood that feeling very well. She picked up her own pencil and turned back to her notebook. They worked until evening, side by side and mostly in silence, and it was the best and most productive silence Clara had spent in years. On the second day after Cal rode to Helena, Dutch came back from an errand in the direction of the Henderson Ranch with information that changed everything. He came in without knocking, which told Clara something was wrong before he spoke, and he looked at Wyatt and said, "The Garrity family. Their barn burned last night." The room stopped. "Anybody hurt?" Wyatt said. "No, they got the animals out, but the barn is gone." Dutch looked at Clara, then back at Wyatt. "Tom Henderson says the Garritys are the ones who didn't sign. One of the 3 families who hadn't signed." Clara looked at the window. "He's doing it," she said. She kept her voice flat because she needed to keep her voice flat. "He's doing what he said. Things that don't wait for federal examiners." Wyatt was already moving. "Dutch, get Cal from the barn." "I need you both." Looked at Clara. "The documentation on the North Ridge. Can you get to it if something happens here?" "Yes," she said. "If something happens, you ride north, not south," he said. "Not to Red Hollow. North to the Henderson Ranch. You understand?" "I understand," she said. "But Wyatt, the Garritys. They need Tom Henderson is already with them," Dutch said. "He sent his 2 boys over last night. They're not alone." "What about the other family?" Clara said. "The Pollocks." "They didn't sign either." Wyatt looked at Dutch. "I'll ride to the Pollocks," Dutch said. "Take the rifle," Wyatt said. "And don't ride the main trail." Dutch was gone. Wyatt looked at Clara. "I'm going to the Garritys," he said. "I know," she said. "Cal will be here." "I know," she said. "Go." He went to the door, and then he stopped, and he turned back, and he looked at her with the complete, unguarded attention that she had learned over weeks was Wyatt Callahan's version of saying things he did not yet have the words for. "Clara," he said. "Go," she said. "They need you more than I need anything from you right now." Go, he went. The day that followed was the longest Clara had spent since her father died. She worked. She organized. She completed the narrative account she had started and began a second document, a formal summary of the pattern of intimidation and destruction that had followed Garrett's filing the family visits, the signed settlements, the burned barn, because what Crow was doing now was also evidence, and evidence needed to be recorded while it was fresh. She wrote with the furious precision of someone who understands that the pen in their hand is the most dangerous weapon currently available to them. Cal stayed in the yard. He was a quiet, watchful presence who required nothing and volunteered nothing, and was exactly what the situation needed, which was someone who would not complicate it by needing to be managed. Mid-afternoon, a rider came, not Crow, not one of his men. A woman. Clara did not recognize her until she got close, a rancher's wife from the southern end of the valley. A woman named Ruth Slade, who Clara had seen twice at town gatherings and who she remembered as someone with the quality of a person who had decided a long time ago that what she thought mattered and was not shy about it. Ruth Slade got down from her horse and looked at Clara, and said without preamble, "You're the Bennett woman. The one who found the records." "Yes," Clara said. "My husband signed one of Crow's papers 2 nights ago," Ruth Slade said. "He thought it was the safe thing. He thought settling was better than fighting." She said this without anger toward her husband, simply as a statement of what had happened. "I need to know if signing makes it worse. For the case." Clara looked at her. "Come inside," she said. Ruth Slade sat at the table and Clara sat across from her and explained, as plainly as she could, what a signed settlement meant legally and what it didn't mean, and what Garrett could and could not do with it, and what the federal examiner's investigation would cover regardless. Ruth Slade listened to all of it without interrupting, which Clara had come to understand was a sign of someone who was actually thinking rather than preparing their response. "He was scared," Ruth said when Clara finished. "My husband. He's not a cowardly man, but he was scared. He had reason to be," Clara said. "Do you?" Ruth said. She was looking at Clara directly. "Are you scared?" Clara thought about this honestly, because the question deserved honesty. "Yes," she said, "but it doesn't change what I'm doing." Ruth Slade looked at her for a long moment. "My husband will be angry that I came here," she said. "He'll think I'm making things worse." "Are you?" Clara said. "No," Ruth said. "I'm making things better. He'll understand that eventually." She stood up. "What can I do? I'm not a record keeper. I don't know about accounts or documents. But I know people in this valley who Crow hasn't touched yet. People who might be willing to say publicly that they've seen what's been happening." Clara felt something move through her that was almost like relief, which surprised her because she had not realized until now how much of this weight she had been carrying, as though it belonged only to her. "Witnesses matter," Clara said. "People who've observed Crow's business practices. Conversations they've had with him or his representatives. Dates. Specific." "I can collect that," Ruth said. "Carefully," Clara said, "without tipping Crow that it's happening." "I know how to talk to people without tipping anyone," Ruth said with the dry certainty of a woman who had managed a ranch and a husband and a community for 30 years. Clara almost smiled. "All right," she said. "One more thing," Ruth said. She reached into the pocket of her coat and took out a folded and put it on the table. "This came to my husband with the settlement documents. He didn't read it carefully. I did." Clara unfolded it. It was a letter from Crow's lawyer, a different man than Garrett, someone in Billings whose name Clara had not seen before. The letter outlined the settlement terms and referenced the land consolidation process. And in the third paragraph, in the middle of a sentence about title resolution, was a phrase that made Clara's hands go very still. The phrase described the consolidation inquiry as having been conducted in accordance with county authority, as delegated by the Territorial Land Commission of 1879. Clara read it again. The Territorial Land Commission of 1879. She knew what that was. She had studied the county record enough to know that the Land Commission of 1879 was a regulatory body that had been dissolved in 10,881 2 years before Crow's consolidation process had taken place. He had cited the authority of a commission that no longer existed, which meant the entire legal framework he had used to justify the consolidation, the framework that made the contested titles look legitimate, was built on a body that had no authority at the time it was being cited. It was not just fraud, it was provably fraudulent fraud. Clara looked up at Ruth Slade. "This letter," she said. "Do you have the original?" "That is the original," Ruth said. "My husband got a copy. I thought the original should be with someone who knew what to do with it." "Mrs. Slade," Clara said. She heard the quality in her own voice steady, but only just. "This may be the most important thing anyone has given me since I started." Ruth Slade looked at the letter and then at Clara. "Good," she said. "Then use it." Wyatt came back from the Garrity ranch that evening. He was tired in a specific way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, the way a person gets tired when they have spent time with other people's pain, and there is nothing adequate to do about it. Clara told him about Ruth Slade immediately, and then she showed him the letter. She watched him read it. She watched his face change. "It cites a commission that was dissolved," he said. 2 years before the consolidation process took place, Clara said. Wyatt looked at the letter. His own lawyer wrote this. Either Crow's lawyer didn't know the commission had been dissolved, Clara said, or he didn't expect anyone to check. The families receiving these documents weren't expected to read them carefully. They were expected to be grateful for the settlement and sign. But Ruth Slade read it, Wyatt said. Ruth Slade read it, Clara agreed. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "I owe that woman a debt," he said. "She'd tell you she did it for the valley," Clara said. "She'd be right," Wyatt said, "but I still owe it." He set the letter down. "Garrett needs this. I've already written it into the second document," Clara said. The narrative account of everything that's happened since the filing. The letter is referenced, and the commission dissolution is cited with the specific date. Wyatt looked at her across the table. He had been looking at her differently in the days since he had said what he said, since "I'd like to talk to you about something," and the difference was not dramatic or obvious, but was there in the quality of his attention, which had always been complete, but was now complete in a way that had a direction to it. "How do you do that?" He said. "Do what?" she said. "Think the way you think, in the middle of everything that's happening. You found Ruth Slade's letter. You understood what it meant. You documented it. You connected it to the existing evidence, all in the space of an afternoon while I was gone." "I've been thinking this way my whole life," Clara said. "Nobody just asked me to use it before." He was very still for a moment. "Then Red Hollow is even more foolish than I thought," he said. "Red Hollow thought I was just a woman with a garden, and some ledgers," she said. "Red Hollow was looking at the wrong thing," Wyatt said. He said it with a certainty that had nothing argumentative in it. He was not defending her. He was simply correcting the record. Clara looked at the table. "When Samuel Garrett gets back," she said. "When the federal examiner comes, this will go to trial." "Yes," Wyatt said. "Crow will hire the best legal representation his money can buy," she said. "And his lawyer will try to discredit the evidence. And one of the things they will try to discredit is me." She looked up. "Because I'm the one who found it. And because I'm a 27-year-old woman from a small town who was hired as a bookkeeper and ended up as the primary witness." Wyatt did not reassure her. He did not tell her not to worry about it. He looked at her steadily and said, "What do you need to make sure that doesn't work?" She had already thought about this. "I need the documentation to be so thorough and so clear that discrediting me would require discrediting every number in it," she said. "Because numbers don't have a gender. Numbers don't have a size or a social history or a list of men who didn't want them. Numbers are just true or they're not. Then we make the numbers so solid that there's nothing to stand on but the numbers," Wyatt said. "That's what I've been doing," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm saying we do it together. Whatever you need from me." She looked at him. "I can write out my full account tonight," he said. "Everything I told you, I was listing every conversation, every transaction, every time Crow's people were on this property. With dates. Signed, that's valuable," she said. "Witness testimony from the property owner." "It's the least useful thing I can give you," he said. "The most useful thing I've got is the property itself." He paused. "I own this ranch, Clara. I have the original deed filed correctly, before any of Crow's manipulation. And that deed includes the northern boundary, exactly as it was before the forgery. The lawyer will have a surveyor," she said. "Then the surveyor should see the original deed," Wyatt said. "And he should see the land itself, which hasn't changed regardless of what was filed at the county office. The physical boundary markers are where they've always been. I put them there myself." Clara picked up her pencil. Tell me exactly where, she said. He told her. She wrote. 3 days later, at 4 in the morning, someone tried to burn the cabin. Clara woke to Cal's voice outside her window, low and urgent, and the smell of smoke, and she was on her feet and had her boots on, before she was fully conscious of being awake. She grabbed the satchel she had kept packed and ready beside her bed since Crow's visit, documentation copies, the Ruth Slade letter, her notebook, and she was through the main room and out the back before the smoke reached the interior. Wyatt was already outside. He had the fire contained to the corner of the woodpile before it reached the cabin wall, which told Clara that Cal had caught it early. Whoever had said it had not expected a man sleeping lightly in the barn. The fire went out. In the dark and the smell of smoke and the adrenaline that took several minutes to subside, the four of them stood in the yard: Wyatt, Clara, Cal, Dutch, and nobody spoke for a moment. Then Cal said, very quietly, "There were two of them. Came from the South Trail. They're gone. You saw their faces?" Wyatt said. "Enough," Cal said. Wyatt looked at the scorched woodpile. Then he looked at Clara. "Yes," she said. She had the satchel in her hand and she was standing on solid ground, and the cabin was not burned. "Yes, I'm all right." Wyatt looked at her for a moment, and in the dark there was something in his face that was beyond anger, beyond the cold calculation she had come to associate with how he handled threats. Something that was more personal than that. Something that had to do specifically with the fact that the fire had been set at a corner of the building near where she slept. "This stops," he said. He said it very quietly. "The examiner," Clara started. "I know," he said. "I know we need the examiner. I know we do this the right way." He was looking at the cabin. "But this stops." He turned to Dutch. "Ride to Red Hollow. Go to the telegraph office. I need to send a wire to Samuel Garrett tonight." "It's 4 in the morning," Dutch said. "Then you'll be there when it opens," Wyatt said. "Tell him what happened. Tell him if the examiner can't be here in 5 days, I'm riding to Helena myself with Clara and everything she's documented, and we are sitting in that office until someone listens." Dutch nodded and went to the barn. Clara looked at Wyatt. "That's not the careful approach," she said. "Careful was right as long as everyone was safe," he said. He looked at her directly. "You're not safe here the way I thought you were. That changes the calculation. I'm not leaving," she said for the second time since Crow's visit. "I know you're not leaving," he said. "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to let me change the strategy." "What's the new strategy?" "We stop waiting for the process to protect us," he said. "We take what you've built and we carry it directly to federal authority ourselves, and we do it now, before Crow has another night to try again." Clara looked at the scorched corner of the woodpile. She thought about 5 families, about Ruth Slade sitting at this table, about 2 families who had signed documents built on the authority of a commission that no longer existed, about the Garrity barn, about 7 men who had walked away from her in a small town and what it had taught her about what other people's willingness to see her was worth. "How soon can we ride?" she said. Wyatt looked at her with the full force of his attention, and in it was everything he had not yet said, everything he had promised to say when this was finished, and she felt it, and she held it, and she did not look away. "At first light," he said. The wire reached Samuel Garrett at 7 in the morning. By noon, a return wire had arrived at the Red Hollow telegraph office, and Dutch brought it back to the ranch at a gallop. Wyatt read it. He handed it to Clara. It said, "Federal examiner arrives Thursday. Do not move. Evidence must be at the ranch." And then, in Garrett's handwriting, which she recognized from his previous letters, "The commission citation gave us everything. Crow's framework is void. This is no longer a fraud investigation. It is now a criminal conspiracy case. Thursday was 2 days away." Clara put the wire on the table. She picked up her pencil. She had 2 days to make what she had built into the most unassailable document in the history of the northern Montana Valley, and she intended to use every hour of them. Outside, Wyatt said something to Cal in a low voice, and Cal saddled up and rode south, and Dutch took up a position at the edge of the yard where the trail came in from the south. And the ranch settled into the watchful alertness of people who know something is coming and have decided they are ready for it. Inside, Clara Bennett wrote, she had never in her 27 years of quiet, overlooked, underestimated life been more certain that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, with exactly the person she was supposed to be doing it beside. The pen moved. The pages filled. Thursday was coming. Thursday came the way important days always come, without fanfare, without any particular signal that this morning was different from the one before it. Just light arriving through the window the same way it always did, and the ranch waking up the same way it always did. Except that Clara had not slept, and Wyatt had slept for perhaps 3 hours, and both of them were at the table before dawn with coffee and the organized stack of everything she had built over the past weeks. She had spent the 2 days after Garrett's wire doing what she said she would do. The narrative account was complete, 41 pages in her clearest handwriting, every transaction documented, every date verified, every comparison figure sourced. The commission citation and its dissolution addressed in its own section with full statutory reference. The original documents were organized chronologically in a separate stack, each one numbered to correspond to a reference in the narrative. The Ruth Slade letter was in its own envelope, labeled and cross-referenced. Wyatt's signed witness account was attached to hers. The 3 additional family statements that Ruth Slade had collected witnesses who had agreed to have their observations recorded were included at the back. It was the most complete thing Clara had ever built. She looked at it in the early morning light and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but was in the territory of both the feeling of a thing done as well as it could be done. "Eat something," Wyatt said. "You said that before," she said. It was true before, he said. It's still true. She ate. The Federal Examiner arrived at 9:30, which was earlier than Clara had expected, and he did not arrive alone. He came with 2 deputies and Samuel Garrett, who had ridden with him from Helena, and a 4th man whose name Clara did not immediately know, but whose coat and manner and the way he characterized himself identified him as someone with specific legal authority of a kind that went beyond what she had anticipated. Wyatt met them in the yard. Clara stayed inside, at the table, with the documentation in front of her, because she had learned by now that the most powerful position she could occupy was the one where she had the work in front of her and could speak to it directly. Garrett came through the door first and looked at her and said, "Miss Bennett, you look like you haven't slept." "I've slept enough," she said. "The documentation," he said. She put her hand on the stack. He looked at it, and something moved through his face that was professional satisfaction of a particular quality, the look of a lawyer who has been told something exists and is now seeing that it is even more than he was told. "This is everything? Everything I found," she said. "Plus subsequent events documented as they occurred." The attempted fire. "In the narrative account," she said. 3rd section from the end. Dated, timed, with Cal's witness statement attached. Garrett turned back to the door. "Harmon," he said. "Come in." The Federal Examiner was a man named Harmon Dale, compact, 50-ish, with the quality of someone who had spent decades looking at documents and could read a page the way most people read a sentence. He came to the table and looked at the stack and looked at Clara and said, "You assembled all of this yourself?" "Yes," she said. "Walk me through your methodology," he said. She walked him through it. She explained how she had approached the records, how she had established the market rate comparisons, how she had identified the pattern in the contract pricing, how she had recognized the forgery in the boundary filing, how she had found the commission citation in the settlement letter and verified the dissolution date. She spoke clearly and without hurrying, and without softening or hedging any of it, because Harmon Dale was not a man who needed anything softened. He listened the way she listened, completely, without interrupting, with his eyes on the documents she placed in front of him as she referenced them. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Bennett, I have been conducting federal examinations in this territory for 14 years. I want you to understand what I'm telling you when I say that this is the clearest and most complete evidentiary account I have encountered in those 14 years." The room was very still. "It's what the evidence supported," Clara said. Because she did not know what else to say, and because it was true. "The commission citation alone would have been sufficient," Harmondale said. "Everything else makes it airtight." He looked at Garrett. "We can proceed today." Garrett looked at Wyatt, who was standing in the doorway. Wyatt looked at Clara. She nodded. What happened in the hours that followed moved with a speed that was both satisfying and slightly surreal. Harmondale and his deputies worked through the documentation with the systematic efficiency of men who knew exactly what they were looking at. Asking Clara questions, she answered immediately and precisely. Referencing documents she located without hesitation because she knew every page of what she had built. Garrett sat beside her and translated the legal significance of each piece for the official record. The fourth man, the one whose authority Clara had not immediately identified, turned out to be a federal marshal named Cray, and at 2 in the afternoon he rode south toward Red Hollow with one of the deputies and a warrant. Nathaniel Crow was arrested at the hotel at 3:30. Marcus Webb was arrested at the county sheriff's office at 4 o'clock. Lawrence Webb was arrested at the county land records office at 4:15. Clara did not witness any of these arrests. She heard about them through the sequence of riders that came back to the ranch through the evening, each one carrying news that accumulated into a picture of a structure being dismantled, piece by piece, by the weight of what she had put on paper. She sat at the table and listened to each report. And each time she thought about the families in the Northern Valley, the Hendersons and the Garrittys and the Pollocks and Ruth Slade, and her husband who had been scared, and she felt the specific satisfaction of a person who has used what they have in the way it was meant to be used. It was Wyatt who finally said, "That's enough for tonight." "The examiner," she started, "is done for the day," Wyatt said. "Dale and Garrett are in the barn with Cal. Nobody's going anywhere tonight." He looked at her across the table. "Clara, it's done." She looked at the table, at the documentation she had built, at the pencil she was still holding, even though there was nothing left to write. "It's done," he said again more quietly. She put the pencil down. The trembling started somewhere in her hands and moved through her before she could manage it, and it was not fear but its aftermath, the release of 2 weeks of held tension, of quiet vigilance, of sleeping with her boots near the bed and the satchel packed, of being in a situation she could not control and controlling the only part of it she actually could. Wyatt came around the table and sat beside her, not close enough to be presumptuous, close enough to be present. "You're all right," he said. Not a question, a statement of something he intended to be true. "I know," she said. Her voice was steady even if her hands weren't. "What you did," he said. He stopped. Started again. "I've said this before, but I'll say it again because it needs saying more than once. What you did, not just the records, but everything. Staying when Crow came, staying after the fire, writing through the night for 2 days." He looked at the stack of documentation. "Nobody who ever knew you should have been surprised by any of it. But they were, and that says more about them than it does about you." Clara looked at the table. "7 men walked away from you," Wyatt said. "And not one of them knew what they were walking away from." "You didn't know either," she said, "when you stopped behind the livery stable." "No," he said. "But I stopped." She looked at him. "I stopped," he said again, simply, without making any more of it than it was. He had stopped, and stopping had been the beginning of knowing, and knowing had led here, to this table, to this evening, to this moment after the thing was done. "You said you wanted to talk," Clara said, when this was finished. "I did say that," he said. "It's finished," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the main hearth moved and the shadows shifted, and outside the Montana evening was settling into the deep blue of a clear night in the mountains. I've been alone for 7 years, he said. Not because I wanted to be. Because wanting had gotten complicated. Because I lost what I had and decided the safest thing to do with the wanting was put it away somewhere I didn't have to look at it. He looked at his hands. It doesn't go away. You put it away and it doesn't go away. It just becomes something you carry without looking at. Clara listened. You walked into my ranch, he said. And you went to work. And you didn't ask me to be anything other than what I was. And you didn't look at me the way people look at men they feel sorry for. And after about 4 days, I understood that I'd been looking at the wrong thing my whole life when I thought about what I needed. He stopped. I needed someone who'd look at a stack of broken records and see a problem worth solving. I needed someone who'd stay when staying was difficult. I needed someone who'd tell me the truth even when the truth was uncomfortable, which, as you know, is not a skill most people have. Wyatt, Clara said. I'm not finished, he said. She waited. I know what you came here for, he said, a job. 3 months. Enough money to fix your roof and get through the winter. I know that's what the agreement was. He looked at her directly. I'm asking you to consider a different agreement. Clara's hands had stopped trembling. What kind of agreement, she said. The permanent kind, he said. He said it with the plain, careful directness of a man who means exactly what he says and has thought about it long enough to say it without decoration. I'm not asking you to change anything about yourself. I'm not asking you to stop doing what you do, or be something you're not, or be smaller so I look bigger. I'm asking you to stay. On the ranch. He paused. As my wife Clara. The fire moved. Clara looked at Wyatt Callahan, at the gray in his beard, and the lines around his eyes and the scarred, careful hands that had been putting this ranch back together one season at a time for 7 years alone, and she thought about 27 years of being looked past and looked through and looked at in the wrong way, and she thought about what it had felt like to hear him say, I see it, and she thought about staying. She had already stayed. She had stayed when Crow came. She had stayed when the fire was set. She had stayed when it would have been reasonable and defensible and very easy to go. She had been deciding for weeks. She had not known she was deciding, but she had been. Yes, she said. Wyatt was still. Yes, she said again, because he looked like a man who needed to hear it more than once. I'm willing. He let out a breath that had more in it than just air. The careful, controlled, self-contained man who had lived alone on a mountain for 7 years let out a breath that carried 7 years in it, and Clara felt it, and she put her hand on the table between them, and he put his over it. And they sat like that for a moment in the light of the fire. It was not a dramatic moment. It was better than dramatic. It was quiet and real and entirely theirs. The weeks that followed were full of the practical business of consequence. Nathaniel Crow's trial was set for the spring term of the territorial court. The charges were substantial fraud, conspiracy, land forgery, witness intimidation, and criminal destruction of property in the matter of the Garrity barn. Garrett wrote to Clara that the prosecution was confident, and that her documentation would be entered as primary evidence, and that the commission citation Ruth Slade had brought her had effectively voided the legal framework underpinning every contested title in the valley. Marcus Webb resigned the county sheriffship before charges could be formally filed against him. He left the territory entirely, which was, Wyatt said, exactly what a man who knew he was guilty and had enough sense to run did. His brother Lawrence was not as quick and faced formal charges. The two families who had signed Crow's settlements received letters from Garrett explaining that the settlements were unenforceable, having been built on fraudulent legal authority, and that their land rights were fully restored. The Garritys received a county assessment of the burned barn's value that would be addressed through the restitution process. Tom Henderson rode up to the ranch on a cold October morning, dismounted without being invited, walked up to Clara where she was standing in the yard, and took his hat off and said, I owe you more than I can say, Miss Bennett. You owe me nothing, Clara said. You held. That mattered. "Mary wants you to come to supper," he said. "Both of you. When things have settled some." "We'd be glad to," Clara said. Ruth Slade became, in the months that followed, something between an ally and a friend, a woman who had seen what Clara could do and had decided, with the directness that was simply how Ruth operated, that someone like that was worth knowing. She came to the ranch twice a month, ostensibly to check on the valley news, actually to sit at Clara's table and talk in the unguarded way of two women who have been through something together and understand each other because of it. On one of those visits, Ruth sat across from Clara and looked at her with the direct, evaluating gaze she always used and said, "You're different from when you first came up here." "How so?" "Easier," Ruth said. "Not softer. Easier. Like something that was braced against something doesn't have to brace anymore." Clara thought about this. "I suppose that's accurate," she said. "He did that?" Ruth said. She meant Wyatt, who was outside within earshot, but not within the conversation. "No," Clara said. "I did that. He just gave me enough room to do it." Ruth Slade nodded, the way she nodded, when something confirmed what she already thought. "That's the right kind of man," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." Red Hollow's opinion, which had been so heavy for so long, became lighter with distance and time. It did not disappear. Small towns do not rescind their judgments easily, and there were women in Red Hollow who had said what they had said about Clara and Wyatt, and were not going to acknowledge that they had been wrong in any direct fashion. But opinion is made of the same material as all judgment, which is information, and information changes. And what Red Hollow knew about Clara Bennett changed over the autumn and winter of 1883, as the news from the territorial court process spread through the valley. The woman who had been publicly humiliated in Dawson's general store on a Tuesday in July had assembled the evidence that brought down the most powerful and corrupt landowner in the northern Montana territory. She had done it with a pencil and a notebook and 37 years of accumulated capability that the town had spent 27 years declining to look at. Gerald Holt, who had said what he said in front of witnesses that morning in July, was seen to cross the street on two separate occasions when Clara came to town for supplies in October. She noticed. She did not mind particularly. A man who crossed the street to avoid you was, in his own way, paying you a form of attention. Mrs. Hartley, who had kept an eye on Clara's garden through the summer, sent a note in November that said simply, "I always knew you were the right kind of woman for this territory, Clara." It just took the territory a while to figure it out. "Your garden is fine," Clara laughed when she read that. She was sitting at the table in the cabin with Wyatt across from her, and the laugh came out before she could stop it, and Wyatt looked up and said, "What?" She handed him the note. He read it. The corner of his mouth moved. "Mrs. Hartley," he said. "Mrs. Hartley," Clara agreed. He handed the note back and looked at her across the table with the complete, unguarded attention that she had spent weeks learning to receive without looking away. She was still learning. She suspected it would take longer than a few months to entirely forget the habit of bracing. But she was learning. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. "That's generally how you start things," she said. "The northern land," he said. "Once the title is restored formally through the court, which Garrett says will happen before winter, I want to start building." "Building?" she said. "The northern pasture needs a proper line cabin," he said, "for the winter grazing rotation. And if we're expanding the herd in the spring, we'll need more hands, and more hands need more accommodation." He looked at the table. "I've been thinking about the Henderson boys. Tom's eldest is looking for steady work. He's capable." "He is," Clara said. She had met him. She had assessed him in the way she assessed most things now, without apology. "What about the records for expanded operations?" "I was thinking that was your department," he said. "I was hired as a bookkeeper for 3 months, she said. "You were hired as a bookkeeper for 3 months, he agreed, and said it in the voice of a man who had proposed something permanent in October, and whose proposal had been accepted, and who found the ongoing use of temporary language gently amusing. And now you're something else. What am I now? She said. You're the person who runs the part of this ranch that I can't run, he said. Which is most of the part that determines whether we make money or lose it. He looked at her. I'd like to put that in writing, if you're agreeable. The financial management. Your name on the accounts. Wyatt, she said. It's your work, he said. Your name should be on it. She looked at him for a moment. At the plain, practical certainty of it, not a grand gesture, not a romantic declaration, but the specific recognition of a specific woman's specific contribution in the most concrete terms available, which was a name on the thing she had built. All right, she said. Good, he said. He picked up his own pencil. Then let's talk about the spring numbers. They talked about the spring numbers. Outside the window, the Montana mountains did what they did. Through every human drama that took place in their shadow they remained, massive and unhurried, entirely unchanged. The same ridge that had been there before Wyatt built his ranch. The same lines of pine, the same river narrowing toward winter. But inside the cabin, things were different from what they had been. The records were in order. The back room that had been 4 crates of chaos was now a proper office with a proper system. And every transaction was documented, and every account was balanced, and every piece of what Wyatt had built was visible and legible and protected. The northern land was coming back. The families in the valley were finding their footing. And at the table in the main room, 2 people who had been looked past and judged and misunderstood by the world around them were building something together, not because the world had finally recognized their worth and decided to cooperate, but because they had recognized it in each other and decided the world's opinion was no longer the most important opinion in the room. Spring came with the news that Nathaniel Crow entered a guilty plea to the federal fraud charges. The trial was shorter than anyone expected because the evidence Clara had assembled left him no viable defense, and his lawyer, who was, as expected, excellent, had apparently reviewed the documentation and advised his client that proceeding to trial against it would accomplish nothing except making the sentencing worse. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to every family he had defrauded, to be calculated from the comparison figures in Clara's documentation. The territorial court sent a formal letter of commendation to Samuel Garrett. Garrett forwarded it to Clara with a note that said, "This belongs to you." The court doesn't know it yet, but I do. She pinned it to the wall in the office above the desk where she worked. When Wyatt saw it there, he looked at it for a moment and then at her and said nothing, which was how he said the things that were too large for words. The wedding was small and practical, which was what both of them wanted, and it took place in the presence of the Hendersons and Ruth Slade, and her husband and Cal and Dutch and old Mrs. Hartley, who had made the 4-hour ride from Red Hollow in a wagon driven by her nephew, and who cried through the entire proceeding with the shameless completeness of a woman, old enough to not care what anyone thought of her crying. Wyatt held Clara's hand through it with the specific carefulness of a man who knows the value of what he is holding. Afterward, on the porch of the cabin, where the evening was coming in over the ridge, and the valley below was fading into dusk, and the mountains were doing what they always did, Ruth Slade came and stood beside Clara and looked out at the same view and said, Well, Clara agreed. 7 men, Ruth said. 7 men, Clara said. Ruth shook her head slowly. They're lost, she said. Clara looked at the valley, at the northern land that was hers now in the fullest sense of that word, at the life she was building in a place that had needed exactly what she had, with a man who had seen it from the beginning. Yes, she said, they're lost entirely. Inside, she could hear Wyatt's voice and Tom Henderson's voice, and the sound of the kind of evening that happens when people who have been through something together are on the other side of it and can afford to be easy in each other's company. She had spent 27 years being the woman nobody chose. Not because she was not enough, not because she was broken or unsuitable or unworthy of the life she had wanted, but because the people doing the choosing had been looking at the wrong thing, measuring with the wrong tools, missing what was directly in front of them. Wyatt Callahan had not rescued her. He had done something more difficult and more rare. He had stopped. He had looked. He had seen her, the real her, the full her, the woman who could read a fraudulent land filing and compile 41 pages of airtight federal evidence and stay on a mountain when powerful men wanted her gone. And he had said, simply and without apology or condition, "This is the person I want beside me." That was not a rescue, that was a recognition. And recognition, Clara had learned, was the thing she had been waiting for her whole life, without knowing the name of it. 7 men had walked away without looking back. The mountain man had stopped. And in stopping, in that one ordinary, unhurried moment behind a livery stable in the summer heat of 1883, everything had changed. Not because the world became kinder or the town became wiser or the men who had judged her learned any particular lesson, but because Clara Bennett had found the one thing more powerful than other people's opinions of her worth. She had found someone whose opinion she respected, and he had chosen her first.